All right, welcome back. I trust everybody got signed in out there appropriately. Mike said remind them again, so I'll be reminding you lots of times today. Our next presenter is a super special man in my life. He is one of the nicest and kindest people you will ever meet. Wouldn't you agree? This is Dr. Scott Hunt, and he has been a member of our council since 2004. He is currently the Associate Dean at Eastern Kentucky University's College of Justice, Safety, and Military Science. He has taught and conducted research in a variety of areas, including problem gambling, published a lot of research. He and I have worked on research together. He is a deacon in the Catholic Church, and he does a lot of statistical stuff that's over most of our heads, and I'm glad we've got people like him to do these things, because I don't like to do that. He asked me if I would introduce Jeremy Kiefer again. Jeremy is with River Valley Behavioral Health. He is the evaluator for numerous grants and programs at River Valley. Jeremy used to work at the crisis line, which is why he knew so much about suicide prevention with our last presenter. Jeremy heads up what the crisis line does for our helpline statistics. And we get those every month to see where the calls are coming from across the state for the 1-800-GAMBLER hotline. So he will be talking a little bit when Scott finishes. So, without any further ado, I'll give you Dr. Hunt.
Thank you. You need to expand your circle of friends there, Rosa. So this presentation is going to be about prevalence rates, and then if we have time at the end, Jeremy will talk about the helpline data. The take-home for the prevalence rates is that small percentages are a big deal. That's the main message. And I want to acknowledge at the beginning that clinicians, therapists, the number that matters to you most is one, the one in front of you, right? And so this is important stuff too, so that you can be ambassadors for the problem, so to speak, so that you can tell folks, that, yeah, it's a small percentage, but small percentages are a big deal. So let me just do a rather quick, he said, overview. So the idea of a prevalence rate. So what a prevalence rate is just a guess. It's a scientific guess. How widespread is a problem? That's the issue. And this is a definition that I pulled from the NIMH. It's pretty standard. Proportion of a population that experiences some event. Now, population is a scientific technical term. What's the population? And in this case, I'm going to focus my comments mainly on adults in the United States in Kentucky. And then you take a sample of whatever the population you're interested in. If you're interested in the nation, then you have to have a national-wide sample. If you're interested in Kentucky, you have to have a representative sample from Kentucky. Good? Okay. Good is good. So I can look over here, can I? You select a sample, and you got to know who's in your population, and you have to have a means of selecting the sample. And using a random sample is the best way to get a good sample. And so that means that every individual you're interested in, adults in Kentucky, has an equal chance of being selected for the sample. So, okay, you have an equal random chance to be selected for the sample. That's very key, because if you get a random sample, you're more likely to have a sample that represents the whole population. So if you were to do what's called a convenience sample, attend a GA meeting and survey the people that attend the GA meeting, or survey the people that come into your clinic or something like that, that's not a random sample. The folks that you encounter there may be different than those, say, not coming in for treatment. And so it's not random, and The problem with not being random is it's not generalizable. You can't generalize then to the population. You've learned something. I'm not saying you don't learn anything that way. I learned the most about gambling problems by attending an open GA meeting for over a year, which was a great experience. But there were some interesting stories and a lot learned, but my study of that, which really wasn't a study, was not generalizable. So problems are reported as a percentage, usually, so what percent of the population has a problem. Sometimes you'll see the same information portrayed as, X number out of 100 or X out of 100,000, and they're all the same. It gets a little confusing, but they're all the same, and the reason they have these different ways of expressing it is because of the rarity of the thing you're interested in. If it's rare, then when you say 2 out of 100,000, you can kind of get a grasp of that. If it's less rare, you can say, 20 out of 100, and you get a grasp of that, or 20%. It's all the same thing. It's all the same thing. And so it can be a little confusing when you see the prevalence rates, because you'll see the same prevalence rate expressed in different ways, and it might lead you to think they don't agree. But they do. It's just a different way of saying the same thing. And that's, I learned in an academic career that's really important, to be able to say things the same way in a lot of same thing in different ways, because you run out of things to say. So anyways, there are several prevalence rates that we could be interested in. All of them would provide information that would be useful. There's no right one way, and so I was going to run over some of those. There's what's called a point prevalence rate. And so, for instance, you might be interested in, did problem gambling increase during the pandemic? And so that's a point in time that you want to do a study. So you do your random sample, you'd get a sample, and you'd see if it increased. But to do an increase, you'd have to know what happened before. So you'd have to have some kind of baseline to make the point prevalence make sense, right? So, but that's useful information. And then there's period prevalence. And so you've probably seen these in diagnostic instruments, right? So in the past 12 months, have you X, Y, or Z? That's a period prevalence, a period of time, 12 months. And those are useful information. You get your active problem gamblers captured in this kind of information. And then there's lifetime prevalence. So the thing with like the period period prevalence is that you might miss a problem gambler who's in remission, so to speak. Right? In the last 12 months, have you? Well, no, I haven't. But the 42 years before, yeah, I did. And I still have a problem, and I'm in GA, I do this sort of thing. So the lifetime prevalence provides a different set of information that is also useful. That's a lot to keep in your head, right? I mean, because your numbers might start to look a little different. You might say, oh, gee, they're talking about different things. Yes, they are talking about different things. But they're giving you pieces of information that you need. Okay? We're good? All right. Let's see if I can get where'd my mouse go? There it is. So representative sample, a little bit more on that. So a random sample, as I said, is one in which the characteristics of individuals sampled closely match the overall population. We want our sample to be a mini version of the population. We want it to be representative. So how do we do this? And the reason we want a representative sample is because in terms of clinical issues and policy issues, it's really important to be able to tell people this represents a bigger group of people. This study, which is a sample of this big group, is a good representation of the big group. Because if it's not, then it's no use to anybody. Academics, You know, people will say, oh, that's an academic exercise, which means useless. It should not be. I mean, a fatal flaw for academic studies is it has no use. And so we want this to be useful. And there's criteria and rules, and it gets a little into the weeds, and I won't take you there, I promise. There are two things, just really two things that determine the chances of obtaining a representative sample. And that word chances is important because it's an odds. You can list the odds of how you're going to get a representative sample or not. There's no perfect study. We're humans. Anyone perfect? No? You, except Jeremy? Jeremy's the only one perfect. But don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, right? There are good studies, and how do we know it's good? And you don't have to be a producer of these studies, but everybody in this room is going to be a consumer, so you need to know which ones are the good ones, right? So one, that what I mentioned previously, everybody in the population has an equal chance of being in the sample. With modern technology, this is a little bit easier because up until the last 15 years or so, you'd have random digit dialed phone numbers. And you could key the phone numbers, you could have a computer do this, right, by area code. So I want to just do Kentuckians, I get Kentucky area codes, and I have at it and let the computer generate the random numbers. I'm not putting my thumb on the scale in any way. It's all good. So what has made that more difficult in the last 10, 15, 20 years? This is no longer an indicator of where we're at in space, right? So survey research generally is having a hard time with this. And who would we most likely miss when we don't have cell phones included? Old geezers like me? Younger folks, right? I mean, there's no landlines. But so anyways, we have to overcome that the best we can and try to have it so that everybody has an equal chance. The second thing, well, before I get to that, that's from the census. So, 3.5 million people in Kentucky, 18 years of age and older. So if I was doing a prevalence study of Kentucky, each one in this room would have a 1 in 3.5 million chance of being included in the study. When you hear people say, I never get called, well, yeah, you didn't win the lottery either. That's horrible odds of being selected. 1 out of so many, right? 1 out of 3.5 million. So that's important, to have a random sample. And then the second thing is a large enough sample. And there's a whole field of study on what's a large enough sample for these kinds of things. In the social sciences, my degree's in sociology, we are plagued by small sample sizes. We do a lot of studies with very small sample sizes because they're cheap and easy. They don't have much oomph, not a lot of representation. And not saying those are bad studies, it's just that you can't generalize from those studies. So if you have too small of a sample, you will introduce a problem. So how big is big enough? It depends. It depends on the problem you're looking at. If you're looking at something fairly common like marijuana use, which last time I looked, I think it was 45% of adults or something like that, you don't have to have a very big sample to get a big enough group of marijuana users, lifetime especially. Problem gambling's a little different because the number's smaller. There's really smaller. So it depends on how big the problem is. And then how confident you want to be that you've captured the population. And again, there's all kinds of statistical tests for this and all that. We won't go down there. But common confidence levels, which if you've had any statistics in your undergraduate training, you've seen this, right? Those confidence intervals are really big deals. Oftentimes we kind of blow by them in a stats class. But do you want to be 90% confident that you've captured the population, 95% confident, or 99% confident? Each increase requires a larger sample size. Now, in your head, bigger sample size, that takes more work. It's going to cost more money. To go from 90 to 95%, it might become a budget issue. We might not have the money to do that. So the higher the confidence level, the more representative, and that's all good. And then you have the factor of margin of error. No study is perfect. Every study has a margin of error. And if you have, and you've seen this like in political polls and stuff, trying to predict elections, it's a plus or minus 4%. That's a pretty narrow margin. It's pretty good. But if you have a smaller sample size, you might be able to say, well, it's plus or minus 12 to 15%, which is not so good. So the lower the margin error, the better. The lower the margin error, the larger the sample size, the more expensive and time-consuming it is. So say that, in this sake of argument, anybody that does statistics out here may take exception with this, but say, for sake of argument, that you need 200 people that experience the condition you're interested in to do any kind of statistical analysis, just 200. And if you're looking at trying to find 200 lifetime, say at the highest end, the addictive gambling, you would need a lot of people. You'd need a lot of people in this random sample. So if you assume a prevalence rate, and you look at the literature and try to figure out what it is, but assume the prevalence rate for the worst form of gambling problems, the addictive gambler, say it's 1% out of the population, 1 out of every 100. You would need to get 200. So how many people would you need to sample? It's a huge number. 200, the number we want, times 100, 1 per every 100, a sample of 20,000 Kentuckians. That's expensive. That's time-consuming. That's beyond the resources of Jeremy and to just do on our own, right? We can't, every day, all day, we'd be trying to sample folks on the phone, and you'd get a very good sample, but a very large one. Now, later we're going to see that when you add problem gambling into the addictive gambling, the percentage might go up to 5 or 6%. And so in your mind, you might say, oh, I could go with a smaller sample. I don't have to have 20,000 because it's not 1 out of 100. It's now 6 out of 100. Not true. If you're interested in the addictive gambling, you still need to do 1 out of 100. And you'll capture the others with it because it's a higher percentage. You go with the lowest number that you're interested in, and that determines your sample size. So hopefully, right, the point I'm trying to make here is this is a complicated, big deal. It's a big, hairy deal. So now we can move on, talking about rare events. Prevalence studies are rare, and when they're done, though, and they're done correctly, they have the proper financing to do all this sort of stuff, they're usually a gold standard in the research field. They're usually pretty good if they've got a representative sample, a large enough sample, and all that. Okay? So, gold standard. Now, in 2008, the Kentucky Council financed a prevalence study in Kentucky. We partnered with the University of Kentucky Research Center, who had the resources to do this thing. They're out of business now, but they used to do an annual survey, and you could buy time. You could have some questions. So we put in the DSM questions, and we did a prevalence study, and we were able to get some demographic information and things. And the 2008 study confirmed, and Dr. Barrett will back me up on this, there's nothing wrong with confirmation studies. It confirmed what is considered the gold standard in problem gambling research about prevalence rates. It was in the ballpark of what the Howard Medical School researchers have found, Schaefer and his colleagues, in an article that was published long ago now, 1999. Now, what the numbers I'm going to show you here are considered the gold standard. This was a meta-analysis. It took a bunch of studies that were prevalent studies in the United States and Canada, and came up with prevalence rates for adults, adolescents, and institutionalized people, which is an interest of mine because that includes incarcerated people. And you're going to see small numbers, small percentage. You look at incarcerated people, instead of 1 to 5%, we're looking at 30%. So there's a difference there. But they did this, and studies since then has confirmed these prevalence rates in Australia, New Zealand, England, all over the world. Right? And we replicated it in Kentucky. So the numbers, on average, about 1.6% is what they call the clinical level, what we call the addictive gambling level. Well, and there's a range, right? And this is that confidence interval. They're 95% confident that it's between this 1.35 and 1.85, 1.6. Somewhere in that neighborhood. Pretty confident. And that's what we found in the Kentucky study. And that seems small, right? And then for the problem gambling, what they call the subclinical level, the average was 1.35 with the 3.85 with a range of 2.94, 4.26. So 95% confident that the problem gamblers represent 3-4% of the population. And again, the 2008 study that we conducted confirmed that. It's close now. So total, 5-6% prevalence study. You want to make sure you get a couple hundred of the addictive gamblers. You'd want 15, 20,000 people. It's a very expensive undertaking and a very time-consuming one. So small percentage, but a big deal. That's my main point, right? Small percentage, but big deal. If you look at the big number, the 5% or so, it's 191,000 Kentuckians, adults. That's not chicken feed, right? That's not a small deal. But some people say, well, that seems too small too, right? That doesn't seem like, why would we invest in programs for prevention or treatment with just 191,000? Well, 191,000, that's about how many, a little less, of adults in Fayette County. There are about 250,000 adults in Fayette County. And, if they were all the problem gamblers were located in Fayette County, that would be an interesting place. Right? 191,000. That's more than all the students at public supported universities in Kentucky. So, that would be all the students that go to Kentucky schools that are publicly supported. Plus. That's not a small deal, right? When you're being the ambassador and say, well, the reason we screen for this is because it's a big deal. Yeah, the percentage is small, but it's a big deal. Right? So I just did this as some comparisons, and they're not good. They're not perfect comparisons. They're good. Estimated addictive problem gamblers. This is the clinical, right? This is the worst. If you look at that, addictive and problem, 5,450 per 100,000 Kentuckians. 11.7 motor fatalities. Is motor fatalities a problem in Kentucky? It's a lot smaller than problem gambling. Motor fatalities is a problem. We don't question that. Right? Homicides, 7.8 homicides per 100,000. Homicide's a problem in Kentucky? Well, yeah, if you got a bullet hole through your nicely pressed shirt, it's a real problem. It's a problem. It's a big problem. Smaller than problem gambling. This one is with COVID. This is a mortality statistic, so it's a little different animal. But 340.45, according to the CDC, 100,000 in the United States died from COVID. That's a lot less than problem gambling. A lot less. It's a big deal. Problem gambling's a big deal, small percentage, big deal. So 5.45% addictive problem gambling. Same thing expressed in a different way. Less than 1% have Crohn's disease in the United States. You watch television, it must be a big deal. There's a lot of ads for medications to help control Crohn's. It's a big deal. It affects people's lives. 1.17 motor vehicle fatalities, we did that. Bipolar disorder, 2.8%. It's a big deal, bipolar. So is problem gambling. People that have had a stroke, smaller percentage. Did the COVID deaths express different? Crack use, 3.7% lifetime. 6.0% PTSD, which is a huge problem. It's statistically insignificant from problem gambling. Problem gambling just doesn't get the press that these others do. And some that are a little higher, heart disease, 8.3%. And people, no need to raise your hand or anything, but a lot of people in this room have bachelor's degrees or higher. You're a small group. It's only a little over 10%, 12%. It's not that much different. I mean, it's twice what the problem gambling thing is, but it kind of gives you a picture of how serious the problem gambling thing is. Right? Alcohol use, 12.7. Hallucinogens, 16.1, cocaine, and then marijuana use as a lifetime use. So it's not as big as marijuana use. It's not as big as alcohol abuse, but it's still a pretty big deal. Right? It's still a pretty big deal. And again, a take home that these prevalence studies that do the job well have had these consistent results. We can look at studies that have been done like in New Zealand, you're going to find the same range. And looking at some other process addictions, very similar prevalence ranges in some of them. So there's something to be done there that hasn't been done, I don't think. So anyways, that's that. So about 1.6% addictive gambling, an additional 3.85%, 4 or 5%. You can take that to the bank. Now, when they are coming to you for help, the only number that matters is 1, but that 1 in front of you may be in this group. And then Jeremy and I were talking outside. Then you have the people that the problem gambler touch. What's that? You know, that's just a best guess, 10, 12, 15, 20 people. And you're there to help them too, right? Because their lives are affected. So I think, Jeremy, that's about the end of it. So Jeremy, if you would do the helpline, and I will step aside.
So a lot of the information that Dr. Hunt provided is really helpful in this way of helping understand the scope of the issue across the United States with perspective to Kentucky. What I'm going to talk about is what we're observing here in kind of our 7-county service region. Our crisis line, our call center, took in 2022, 27,000 calls. That's counting individuals reaching out for point of entry services to schedule appointments over to our crisis call center, which was about a good 2/3 of that. Of that number, we saw a 27% increase per month in callers to our Gamblers Crisis Line, to about, which is quite a bit. And a big part of that is, and Dr. Hunt mentioned this, due to COVID, the pandemic. Casinos were shut down due to safety procedures, so we saw a jump in online casinos, online gaming resources for people, as well as mobile phone gaming that you could have at your leisure, on-demand access, which is a big issue. What we also saw was a 5% increase per month last year in calls related to suicide. About 114 calls a month for suicide. If you couple that, like Dr. Hunt mentioned, small numbers add up. 5% of every 47 callers that we got per month for individuals reaching out for gambling issues were at risk for suicide. So every 2. And that's kind of, like Dr. Hunt mentioned, we want to pay attention to the most important person is the one that you're working with at that time. Keep in mind that this is a very real possibility, not just for the individual you're working with, but those that individual's decisions have touched, the people that are being impacted there as well. It's really all I had. Thank you.